Good afternoon, folks. This is Pastor David Metter from Holy Net Christian Church, and I want to be the first, hopefully, to wish you a very happy and blessed Easter on this April 12th of 2020. I hope you've had a blessed Holy Week. I hope you're doing okay. I hope you and your family and loved ones are safe. I know these continue to be very, very stressful times for everyone, and so just know we at Holy Net Christian Church are praying for you and your families and loved ones and the trials and tribulations you're going through in these tough times. For my sermon for Easter Sunday, the text will be John's Gospel, chapter 20, verses 1 to 18. And I'm going to be focusing on the Easter message, the good news of the empty tomb from the perspective, especially of one person today, and that is Mary Magdalene. The title for my sermon for this Easter is Foot Races, Cemeteries, and the Gardener. And before we dive into the sermon, please allow me this Sunday, and I'm going to keep it a little briefer than last Sunday as far as announcements and stuff for this Easter Sunday morning. But let me please read for you from John's Gospel, chapter 20, verses 1 to 18. And this is from the New International Version of the Bible. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes, but Mary stood outside the tomb, crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb. She saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they've put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. "Woman," he said, "why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking that he was the gardener, Mary said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, please tell me where you have put him, and I will go get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to Mary, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet returned to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am returning to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. Now may God bless the reading and understanding of his word to us this glorious and blessed Easter of 2020. Sometimes good news is hard to believe, isn't it? Why is it so hard for you and me to believe good stories, to believe good news, when we seem to accept and believe bad news without any doubts? I want to tell you a story. This story is from the book Finding Meaning, by David Kessler. And it's a story about a mother named Gail. Gail Bowden's child, Brandon, was born with spina bifida. He had to use a catheter to go to the bathroom, wear braces on his legs, and use a wheelchair. Yet Gail was determined as a mom to give him a great life. Thanks to Gail, Brandon grew up very happy. He loved the color yellow, it turns out, and he took a liking to cars, especially yellow Volkswagen Beetles. Before long, Brandon had quite an extensive toy car collection. When Brandon was 17, however, one day Gail walked into his room, and there she found Brandon unresponsive. He was transported to the hospital as quickly as possible, but then the doctor gave Gail the heartbreaking news that Brandon would never wake up. He said that her son was essentially dead, and she might consider donating his healthy organs to help other people. Although Gail could scarcely process what was happening in those moments, she agreed to the donation. If they couldn't save Brandon's life, at least he would get to save other lives. Without realizing it, Gail was seeking meaning, Dr. Kessler says, in her son's life and death. She sat with her son as they removed his breathing tube, and he quietly passed away. It was very peaceful, she said, and Gail believed that her son had indeed returned to heaven. A few years later, just after Gail's son Brian, her second son, went off to summer camp, it turned out that Gail moved into a new home. Gail was unpacking boxes when one day she heard a knock at her door. She had arranged for a worker to come and paint her new apartment, her new home, using Brandon's favorite color, the color yellow. "Hi, I'm Ken the painter," the man said. "You're a week early," Gail replied, getting a look at Ken for the first time. "Well, my first job in the area was canceled, so the company sent me over early. Everything is still in boxes, though," she told him. "I was hoping to organize things before you came, but since you're here, well, you might as well go ahead and get started with the painting." Ken began painting, and Gail continued to unpack in her new home. "Do you live alone?" Ken asked her. "Well, my son Brian is at camp." "Do you have any other kids?" he asked. Gail had dealt with the awkwardness of that question before. Sometimes she talked about Brandon, but other times, she said, "Well, it's just Brian and me." For some reason, this time the question caught Gail off guard, and she stood there, startled, wondering, what do I say? "I had another son," she finally said. "His name was Brandon, and he died when he was 17. "I'm so stupid," Ken replied. "I always stick my foot in my mouth. I'm so sorry for asking." "It's okay," she told him. And he continued then to paint. After a few minutes, Ken said, "I'm sorry about your son. I know what it's like to be very sick myself. I almost died, as a matter of fact, 4 years ago when I was just 42 years old. But my life was saved by a kidney transplant. I just celebrated my 4-year transplant anniversary last month." Gail paused and asked, "When did you have your transplant?" "February," Ken replied. "February what?" Gail asked. "February 13th, 2008, he said. "I'll never forget that date. Brandon died on February 12th, 2008. "Wow, what a coincidence," Ken said. "My donor was a 21-year-old man who died in a car accident." Gail continued packing. And then Ken went back to painting. After a little while, Gail decided she needed to go out and run an errand, and she left Ken alone in her apartment with one wall painted yellow and still working. However, when Gail came back from running her errand, she found that Ken was in her apartment, standing there, right where she had left him. He was staring into space, it seemed. He hadn't made any progress at all. Is there something that's wrong, Ken? Gail asked. I lied to you, he said solemnly. What, you're not a painter? Gail said. No, not about that, Ken said. The truth is, Gail, I have Brandon's kidney. What? She said. When you told me that Brandon was your son's name and you were Gail, I realized that I'd received a letter from you after I had had my transplant. I was given the option to write back to you, and Gail, I'm so ashamed to say it, but I never did. Stunned, Gail picked up the phone and called the transplant center where her son Brandon had given his organs. She told the counselor that she talked to, I have hired a painter and he told me that he has Brandon's kidney. How can we be sure? The transplant counselor said this, the odds of that occurring would be almost impossible, but give me his name. Gail asked Ken his full name, and Ken gave it to the counselor. He received the confidential file, or the counselor then reviewed the confidential file and confirmed that indeed Ken had received one of Brandon's kidneys when he passed away. Gail began then to cry when she heard this. Ken was equally shocked by the unlikely connection that had been given between these two people. Gail found enormous meaning in knowing, Dr. Kessler writes, that her son's kidney was in this living, breathing man. When Brian got home from camp and heard what had happened, he said to the two of them, it's as if Brandon found his way home, Mom. In the midst of her loss, Gail had accepted the tragedy in front of her. She made meaning of her son's life by deciding to donate his organs, determined that Brandon would live on by saving the lives of others. Later, when Gail met Ken's wife and kids, she realized how much his children had needed him. They had been in dire straits. Not only had Brandon's kidney, in fact, saved Ken's life, but it had had a dramatic impact on Ken's family as well. Dr. Kessler writes in his book, you may be thinking at this point that Gail lived in a small town, and it wasn't such a remarkable coincidence that Ken ended up as her painter. Even if that were true, the odds against her discovering that he had her son's kidney were long. Just consider these possibilities. Gail might not have mentioned her son, Brandon, to Ken. Ken might not have mentioned his kidney transplant to her. Gail might have painted the room herself and never met Ken. Gail might have hired a different company to do the painting. The company might have sent a different painter. If Ken had come at his scheduled time, Gail might not have been as available to talk. You may still think that these are just some fortunate coincidences. A good story that's too good to be true. But the reality is, Dr. Kessler writes, that Gail doesn't live in a small town. She lives in Buffalo, New York, where there are 1,800 painters to choose from. In the end, it doesn't matter whether the odds of Gail's meeting Ken were long or short. To Gail, it felt as though it was meant to happen, a validation of everything that she had done. When she had donated Brandon's organs, she had decided that something good was going to come out of the bad. Meeting Ken, Gail was able to see that good in action. Today, Gail works with other families as they go through the organ donation transplant process in helping others make some of the toughest decisions of their lives. Gail continues to create meaning from Brandon's life. I wonder, while I was telling that story, did you have trouble believing that it was true? If you did, I wonder, why was it hard for you to believe that that's a true story? I'm not scolding anyone by asking these questions because, quite honestly, the first time I read the story, I struggled to believe that it was true. So my doubts about it got me to thinking, why is it so hard for me to accept the truth of this story? It's heartwarming, it's wonderful, it's powerful, it touches my heart as it's been told to me, but something about it makes me want to doubt it. It raises questions. I struggle with it. Sometimes, friends, isn't it that way with the Easter story too? If we're honest about it, sometimes we can't help but think, is this too good to be true? Sometimes it's too hard to believe, I think, and maybe that's because it's such a good, powerful, heartwarming, positive, hopeful story. In John chapter 20, Mary Magdalene, a woman, by the way, who had been possessed by 7 demons before she met Jesus Christ, goes to check on Jesus' burial place where he's buried in the tomb in a garden, we're told in John, after the horrors of Good Friday and the crucifixion. John 20 tells us that it is very early in the morning, by the way, on the first day of the week. What was she expecting to find there in the garden early that morning? What was she thinking? Was she thinking at all, being that she was in the throes and the trauma of grief for the loss of her friend? Only hours before, it must have seemed to Mary, she had seen with the other women when they crucified him what it was like to lose someone you loved in violence and in suddenness and to suffer the shock. Was it all a blur to her? Could she ever stop crying? Surely someone with Mary's past had felt loss before, I would think, but this loss? This was unlike anything Mary had ever been through before. Denial, anger, bargaining, and depression could not, I think, begin to do justice to what Mary was feeling that morning. She felt a darkness beyond the darkest night. She felt that she had lost forever the one person whose very presence made her smile with hope. She felt an emptiness nothing could fill, and no one perhaps could feel, so deep down that her memories of being possessed seemed insignificant by comparison. She couldn't stop crying. It was all Mary could do, I think, to keep walking that morning in the darkness toward the garden. Then she got there. Looking back, it was weird in a way for her to remember all of a sudden being there. Tears streaming down her face and seeing something she couldn't figure out in the darkness. The stone had been removed from the tomb. What on earth? And then she was running. Running. How long was her run to Peter and the beloved disciple? She couldn't remember. Somehow she ran and never felt tired at all, I think. No, nothing Mary knew she was not knowing that she was out of breath and suddenly talking to Peter and the other disciple, the beloved one. She was so in their presence, what? Mad? Afraid? Worried? Concerned? Frantic? Out of breath. Why, on top of everything, she must have been thinking, would someone steal Jesus' body? What's the point? How could anyone be so cruel in these times? She didn't understand. She could barely get the news out of her mouth to Peter and the beloved disciple before they were on the move, gone, racing to see for themselves. What on earth was going on? She couldn't keep up with them on the way back to the tomb, I would think. They ran too fast. So she just walked. While she had been talking to the men, Mary had felt, I would think, a little better. But now, walking back to the tomb by herself to the garden, the tears and the questions, all the anxiety and fear came rushing back like a flood, flooding her soul, blushing her face. By the time Mary got back to the graveside, she was weeping, struggling again to breathe, much less think, all alone. For the first time, Mary herself looked inside inside the tomb where he had been buried. Things went from weird to strange. There were two angels in white, and they asked her what to me seems like an almost offensive question, with all due respect. Woman, why are you weeping? Why am I weeping? Come on. Why am I weeping? Can angels be that insensitive? Why am I weeping? She must have felt something like Sally Field's character in the movie Steel Magnolia. Have you ever seen that movie? Do you remember that scene? She's a mom whose daughter that she loves deeply has died after having a baby that they warned her daughter not to have for health reasons. It has been the funeral at the cemetery and it's over, and the mother's grief overcomes her. And she says to her friends that are trying to comfort her, you know, I just want to punch something. I want to punch somebody. And when she says that, one of the friends says, well, just hit Weezer. Punch her in the face. I can't help but think that Mary Magdalene, in that moment, when she first heard the question, woman, why are you weeping? Must have had a little bit of that sense of, why am I weeping? I just want to punch something. I've lost the one who made my life have meaning, who turned my life around, who saved my soul. Then Mary turned around. Did she suddenly, I wonder, have the feeling that someone else was standing there that morning in the garden? A man was there. He asked her the same question then that the angels had asked, except this man that she thought was the gardener asked her something else too. He asked, woman, why are you crying? Whom are you looking for? Well, she was looking for Jesus' dead body, of course. She needed to make sure the body was properly cared for, didn't she? Before she could move on in her grief. And to make matters worse, she's found the gardener. Oh well, maybe the gardener could help her find the body after all, it seems to dawn on Mary. Maybe the gardener knows something that can help her find Jesus. And then she hears it. Her name must have never sounded so good. She had never felt this way before. This dawn was somehow now different, unexpected, like nothing that she could imagine happening. She just wanted to hug him, I think, and never let go of Jesus again. It was hard at first when he told her that she had to let go. It must have been because she didn't understand why. She couldn't. But now, looking back, she was so glad she did because Jesus was present to her in a new way that, well, was hard to explain, but it was better even than his being there in person. It had taken some time, I think, for Mary, but then she felt that way, and it was even better than she imagined. She was glad in the end that she had listened to Jesus and learned to let him go. She was glad she had obeyed Jesus and shared the news with the disciples just as John tells us Jesus had told her to. For Mary, you see, had found what she, in fact, was looking for. She had to tell somebody, to share the good news. Her mourning had turned to joy. Amen. According to New Testament scholar and preacher Thomas Long, speaking about our text for this Easter, John's Gospel makes it clear that what humanity truly seeks is what Mary found in that cemetery early on that first Easter morning. The risen Christ, the light that shines in the darkness, the very embodied glory of God. This Easter Sunday morning, in the midst of a COVID pandemic that has rocked many of us to our foundations, creating already much grief and loss, I believe that the risen Christ for us can also turn our tears, our mourning, into joy if we will turn to him and in him find the one that we too are looking for. And so I would like to close my sermon by asking all of us to consider again the question of the angels and the question of Christ, the question of John's Gospel. Whom and what are you looking for? Are you looking for hope? Are you looking for life? Are you looking for forgiveness and grace? Like Mary, I can tell you that in Jesus Christ I have found hope in grief, love which overcomes loss, and a relationship that only gets better and deeper over time. Is that, friends, what you want too? If it is, this Easter, would you consider coming home to Jesus Christ and finding what you are looking for? I pray that you will turn to him in this time and find life and meaning for your life and the one who can help with your tears of grief and pain and suffering as well. Before I close by wishing you all again a very happy and blessed Easter 2020, I want to close with this charge and blessing and wish you all a very blessed and happy Easter. Receive the good news. Christ is risen from the dead. Tell the good news. The power of death shall no more oppress us. Live the good news. We are free to love as he has first loved us. May God, who raised Jesus from the dead, bless you by the power of the Holy Spirit and raise you with him in glory. Amen. He is risen, folks. He is risen indeed, and to God be the glory. Happy Easter to all of you, and may God bless you on this Easter Sunday. Take care.